Over the last few years, Magic the Gathering has embraced Universes Beyond, where they release Magic the Gathering cards based on existing IP, like Doctor Who, Lord of the Rings, or the recently announced Marvel collaboration. Personally, none of the Universes Beyond so far have particularly appealed to me. So today, I'd like to talk about some Universes Beyond that I would love to see. An IP that I think would be really great in Magic the Gathering would be Terraria. I think that Terraria would be great as a Universes Beyond for a number of reasons. First, and you'll hear me say this a lot throughout this video, the aesthetic of Terraria fits incredibly well into the world of Magic. The biggest issue with Universes Beyond, like Jurassic Park, Transformers, or The Walking Dead, is that their art and worlds don't particularly mesh well with Magic's established style, especially when you compare it to something like Lord of the Rings, whose theme and world fit incredibly well in Magic's existing world. Since Terraria is generally a survival fantasy game, the aesthetic is pretty close to Magic's. Terraria's world is something that I would love to see in an official Magic art style. The game is made almost entirely in pixel art, so the only real detailed art we get of Terraria's world is only really seen in promotional images like they have in the cover art for the game. Being able to see something like the Wall of Flesh or the Moon Lord in a fully detailed render would be absolutely amazing. And I think Terraria is a game that has a lot of depth to pull from if you were designing a set around it. The game is littered with unique items, bosses, NPCs, and events, all of which could be great sources for cards. And I think there's a ton of potential designs you could pull from here. Another IP that I think should get a Universes Beyond is Fire Emblem. If you've watched my channel before, you may know that I am an enjoyer of the Fire Emblem series. The series is heavily inspired by European fantasy, with the stories often being about warring kingdoms in medieval times, and I think that setting and story would fit incredibly well into Magic's existing universe. And the series has a ton of lore that you can pull from to make cards for. If Magic the Gathering ever decided to do a collaboration with Fire Emblem, I think there's a ton of different directions that they could take it. They could do something like they did for the Doctor Who decks, where they have commanders for each of the different games in the series. You could have one deck based off of Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, with Ike helming it as the commander, or you can make another deck where Roy is leading it and it's based off of cards from the Binding Blade and Blazing Sword games, or they could lean really hard into one particular game. I think a really cool idea would be having commander decks based around Fire Emblem Three Houses, where each deck is based off the different routes that you can take in the game. Or they could do something similar to what they're going to do for the Final Fantasy set, where they make cards based on characters all throughout the series, rather than just picking from one game in particular. Another reason I think Fire Emblem would be awesome is because of an artist I follow on Twitter by the name of Kiln, who has made Magic the Gathering proxies in the style of old Fire Emblem games back on the Game Boy Advanced. And I would absolutely love if they made actual cards in this kind of style for their special border treatment for this set. While the series I have suggested so far fit pretty well into that classic fantasy art style, I would love to see something that differs a bit from the usual setting. And I think a great choice for that would be the Binding of Isaac. Now at first glance, the Binding of Isaac may seem like a weird choice, since the game is pretty gross when compared to the classic fantasy settings that I've mentioned before. However, I still feel like the style of the game fits pretty well into Magic's existing style, since I think a lot of the monsters and creatures that we find throughout the game could fit pretty well into a plane like Innistrad. They could also probably focus a bit more on the toned down elements of Isaac and less on the gross gory bits. Also, I think out of all my suggestions today, the Binding of Isaac is one that could make the best actual product. The creator of Isaac, Ed McMillan, is a fan of Magic the Gathering, and he's actually even already made a card for the game, with him making a card for Core Set 15 and the card Cruel Sadist. Additionally, he's also made the game The Binding of Isaac 4 Souls, which is a Binding of Isaac card game that is heavily inspired by Magic the Gathering, and if you haven't played this game, I would highly recommend it, by the way. It is really fun. Another fun fact is that he also did an interview with the professor all the way back in 2019, so the man clearly has a strong connection to Magic the Gathering. And my hope would be that if for whatever reason Magic the Gathering did actually end up doing a collaboration with the Binding of Isaac, that they would bring in Ed McMillan to be a part of the design process, since he clearly knows both games super well, and I think he would be able to work with them to make an amazing product. Another somewhat silly idea I have for Universes Beyond would be to make a set around Baldur's Gate 3. Now obviously we do actually already have Baldur's Gate cards in Magic the Gathering with the set Battle for Baldur's Gate Commander Legends, but I would love if they made a set solely around Baldur's Gate 3. The game is the most recent in the series and is still incredibly popular, with it still topping Steam charts even months after release. And the game has so much to pull from that I think you can make a full set around just Baldur's Gate 3. One other thing that's important to note is that the existing Baldur's Gate 3 cards are all based on the early access build of Baldur's Gate 3, and not the full release, since the Commander Legends set actually released before the game fully did, and this creates some issues. One of which being the design of the characters, since the art for Commander Legends was based on the beta designs for the Baldur's Gate 3 cast, some of the characters kinda look different than their final designs. I think probably the character that suffers the most from this is Minthara. If you look at her current version in the full release of Baldur's Gate 3, and then compare it to the Magic the Gathering card version of her, you can see that it doesn't really match super well. While it does kind of make sense if you look at her beta design, I still think this is a pretty striking difference and it kind of takes me out of it a bit. The early access build also has the issue of only having up to Act 1 in it, so a lot of the party members and storylines weren't fully complete. And since the design team at WotC doesn't really have as much to build off of, it seems like a lot of the designs for the Baldur's Gate 3 party members specifically is pretty generic, with most of them just being background commanders. Probably the most flavorful designs are Asterion and Halsim, and even then, it's pretty much just that Asterion's a vampire and Halsim's a druid. I think if you replaced either of these two cards with some generic Magic the Gathering character, it would still fit pretty well. And having the opportunity to make new versions for all of these characters that incorporate more of their lore, personalities, and quest lines would be pretty great. And also because they only had access to Act 1 when designing it, they could make cards around some of the more important characters that become more relevant later in the story. For example, they weren't able to make cards off of somebody like Ketheric Thorn, Mizura, or Isabel. I also think the game has a ton of fun questlines and NPCs that you could pull from to make new exciting cards around, like the Anti-Ethel questline, or Barkus Root, or my personal favorite, the Strange Cow. Regardless, this game has a ton to pull from, and I really hope they revisit it in the future. Finally, I saved the absolute best for last. This series, compared to anything else, is the one that I want a Universes Beyond around the most. I would love to see a Universes Beyond based on a From Software Soulsborne game. Be it Elden Ring, Dark Souls, or Bloodborne, I think all are great options. They would all be absolutely amazing additions. I am a massive fan of the Soul series. The bosses, the combat, the world, and its lore is all amazing. The world of From Software's games have a special place in a lot of people's hearts, myself included. So getting the opportunity to have any of their games combined with Magic the Gathering would be a dream. I think more than any of the other series I mentioned today, the Soulsborne games fit the Magic the Gathering art style the best, because the designer of a lot of the Soulsborne series, Miyazaki, actually plays Magic the Gathering and often uses it as a reference point for designing his worlds. And you can see this pretty directly, with these enemies in Bloodborne basically just holding the Lantern of Insight, and the card Sun Petal Grove basically just appearing in Elden Ring. The Soulsborne series has so many iconic characters, weapons, and NPCs. There are so many different options you can pull from. You have iconic locations like Firelink Shrine, Crumbling Farum Azula, or the entirety of Yharnam. You have iconic bosses to pull from like Orenstein and Smo, Radon, or Martyr Ligarius. You have iconic NPCs like Ronnie, the doll, or the goat Solaire, and I really hope that this happens at some point in the future. If you enjoy Magic the Gathering and the Soulsborne series, you should check out this video where I made custom cards based on Bloodborne.